Welcome to Confessions of a Parent Coach. I'm parent coach, mother of four, and your host, Ann Kaplan. This is the podcast where you will learn that even for parenting experts like me, there is no such thing as a perfect parent, and that fabulous behavior and amazing relationships are right on the other side of that realization. If you're working your butt off to do right by your kid, honor yourself, and go beyond the BS around you, you are my person, and this podcast is for you. Full disclosure, I'm a sometimes potty talker, and we deal with the challenge of raising kids here. This podcast is for grown-ups, so stick your earbuds in and let's do this. Well, hello, listener. Welcome back into another episode of the Confessions of a Parent Coach podcast. Happy to be here with you. Super sunny day. It is cold outside, but really nice and sunny. So here I am. All the sun's flowing through the window directly into my face. So hopefully I do not get blinded while I'm looking at my notes here. Oh my goodness. What I want to talk about today is boundaries. And I have to tell you a little bit of a funny story. So as you all know, I run a group coaching program for moms, and I love my mamas in this group. We are a small but mighty group of women who are fearlessly working on just doing the work, getting better, healing our stuff, and showing up the way that we know is best for our families and for ourselves. These women are just such courageous warriors. I love them. Some of them have been with me since the day I launched the group. Some of them have just joined a few months ago or a few weeks ago even. But one thing we all have in common is that we're really plugged into actually really doing this work and loving each other and having compassion and breaking away from all of these generational cycles that we've inherited from our past and all that great stuff. I always like to say, like, it's fun, it's work, but it's fun. I actually really love that, get down and dirty with my psyche, with my demons, all that stuff. So that's one thing we all have in common. And when I launched this podcast, I said, I'm going to be answering questions at the end of each episode, and I'm going to be taking questions from listeners. But obviously, at first, I'm not going to have listeners. So I'd love to take questions from y'all, and I'll answer those as my listener questions. And the questions these mamas came up with, first of all, my thought was like, oh, you guys are amazing. And second of all, like, wow, you guys are really doing your work, because these are not the kind of questions that I'm going to get from a newbie. I was expecting questions like, when's the best time to night wean your baby? Or like, when's the best time to start teaching kids chores, or what chores should they do? Like, really those simple, basic parenting questions that we all, question sometimes, where we come to the next fork in the road and we're like, I don't know, like, how do I teach my kid how to drive, for example? Or, how do I deal with high school homework stuff? Oh, that's a new frontier for me. So we have those kind of questions. And that was the kind of questions I was expecting from them. But holy moly, these girls went for the jugular with their questions. Their questions were like, who are boundaries for? And I'm like, oh my gosh, I love this question, but also it's not going to mean anything to anyone who hasn't started doing this work yet. So I just thought that was a really funny, amazing story about like how far along everybody is in their work, even the people who are, just starting out, that common thread of really wanting to go deep and really look at these things is there. So even when someone's only been in the group for a week or two, the questions I'm getting from them and the discussions that we're having are really, really profound. And it was a little bit of affirmation for me of like, okay, yeah, we're doing some real stuff in here. So if you're interested in that group, know that it's always open for you. It's a lifetime program. It is phenomenal. And if these kind of deep, really a profound conversation sound like they get your juices flowing, you probably belong in there with us. But anyway, the whole reason why I brought that up is because I got so many questions about boundaries when I asked for great like end of episode questions, the ideas that people were talking about who are boundaries for, what are boundaries, and those kinds of things. I thought, you know what, might not be great for an end of session, end of podcast episode question, but it would be a great podcast episode topic. And so that is what we are going to talk about today. And what is my confession? We have to start these episodes with me bearing my soul to you, right? I'm going to make a confession to you that is very true and raw. My confession is that I really used to think about boundaries the same way a 6-year-old thinks about boundaries. I really walked around in my head with the idea, like 6-year-old's idea of boundaries. And what I mean by that is I'm going to give you an example. So my youngest kiddo is 8 right now, but this story happened when he was 6. And this is when I realized, like, oh my God, I have a 6-year-old's idea about boundaries. Or I should say I had a 6-year-old's idea about boundaries. Sky used to go around the house all the time if like one of his brothers would tickle him, or if somebody would, like, whatever, say they were going to read a story to him, but then they didn't, which is like all the brotherly sibling stuff that happens in our house, right? He would say, you can't cross my boundary. My boundary is that you can't tickle me. My boundary is that you have to read me a story. That's my boundary. That's my boundary. That's my boundary. He used to say it all the time, which I think is hilarious. Also reflects how often we talk about boundaries in our family, that my 6-year-old was flinging the word boundary around all the time. But I realized, like, oh my gosh, I recognize myself, right? Have you heard that expression? Like, I resemble that, right? Now, at the time, I didn't resemble that any longer, but I totally used to, because what Sky's idea of boundaries is I say something and then you have to do it. A boundary is a thing I say or a line I draw in the sand that controls you, that changes your behavior. A boundary is for changing the situation that we're in. We change our circumstance so that we don't have to feel crappy anymore. I don't want to be tickled. My boundary is you can't tickle me. I want you to read me a story. My boundary is you have to read me a story, right? Or especially with Sky, what he really was saying was that my boundary is you can't say you're going to do something and then not do it. Because that really would bother him, understandably, when his brothers would do that. But I have to tell you that almost every single new client that I work with is still walking around with that same 6-year-old's idea of boundaries in their head. And who can blame them? This is what we are told is good parenting. It's teaching your kids to do the stuff you want them to do. Or instead of saying teaching, most of my clients in the beginning anyway say getting. How can I get my kid to do their homework? How can I get my kid to go to bed? How can I get my kid to eat his dinner? That's what we are told is the point of good parenting. And it's what we experienced, most of us, when we were kids. We experienced that that's what parents do. They get their kids to do stuff. And then we also hear these ideas about boundaries. Now, boundaries are in like the zeitgeist. You hear them everywhere. It's like psychobabble. It's a hot buzzword. And a lot of the stuff we hear about boundaries is like, boundaries are healthy. You have to have boundaries in a healthy relationship. Okay, great. I'm going to combine those two ideas. Boundaries are good, and I'm supposed to control you. And what do you know? I'm going to use my boundaries to control you. Yay. But guess what? It doesn't work. That's not actually boundaries. So just today, I had my first session with a new client, and we're kind of talking. And about like 20 minutes into our session, I kind of was like, let's put a pause here, because I think I'm starting to get an idea of what would be a really great thing for you to work on between now and our next session. And that is, what even is a boundary? And let's look back at how often in your family have you actually been setting boundaries? And this mom, it was like her head exploded. She was like, yes, because we have to back it up that far sometimes. So let's do that. Let's talk about what even is a boundary. And the first thing I'm going to do is share a couple of quotes about boundaries that I really, really like, and I share a lot with my clients. The first one is, any relationship is only as healthy as the boundaries within it. So if you're with your kiddo not actually setting healthy boundaries, which we're going to talk about in a minute, and actually enforcing those boundaries, your relationship is not as healthy as it could be. And we know, you'll probably hear me say this a million times on the podcast, we know what's so healthy and important for children is this authoritative parenting dynamic, which means that it has two things: a healthy emotional connection, attunement, relationship between mom and kid, or dad and kid, or parent and kid. And the second thing is a high degree of leadership between parent and kid. And if you're not setting boundaries, healthy, appropriate boundaries, and enforcing them healthily and appropriately, you do not have that leadership component on board. You are not authoritatively parenting. So any relationship is only as healthy as the boundaries within it. That's quote number one. Quote number two is let me start over because it's really important. People set boundaries to keep people in their lives, not to push them away. Think about that. I love that quote so much for two reasons. One, it starts to open the possibility that boundaries might actually be something that bring people closer together. Wow. How about that? Boundaries can bring you closer together because I set a boundary with you because I want to figure out a way for us to stay in each other's lives and have it be positive and joyful and fulfilling and all of that stuff. If I didn't care about having you in my life, I wouldn't bother setting a boundary with you. I'd just walk away, right? Or minimize the amount of time I spent with you, or do all those other passive aggressive things that people do when they don't want to set boundaries, which will ultimately mean a breakdown in the relationship and you're not in my life anymore. So when you feel a child setting a boundary with you, what? Oh my God, let's talk about that later. Holy mackerel. Kid setting a boundary with you, is that even a thing? What do we do when our kids do that? When you feel a kid setting a boundary with you, your partner setting a boundary with you, a friend setting a boundary with you, what if the feeling of that boundary being set, probably going to bring up a lot of maybe unpleasant feelings, but what if another feeling it brought up was the feeling of like, wow, I'm really important to this person. So with that being said, all about boundaries, what even is a boundary? And I think we can answer that question a lot better when we think about what are boundaries for? What is the purpose of boundaries? And who are boundaries for? And the answer to those questions are boundaries are not for controlling other people. They're not about getting a response out of somebody or changing a situation. Boundaries are about how we take care of ourselves. Boundaries are something that we say, how are we going to take care of ourselves in a certain situation? So in the example of Sky saying like, don't tickle me, that's my boundary. An actual boundary could be, when you tickle me, I'm going to take space from you. Or I spend time with people who don't tickle me. Or when people tickle me, I go and take care of my body by myself. Those are all boundaries. And what you can hear in those boundaries are two things. One, it's about me. It's not about the other person. I'm not telling another person what they have to do, and I'm not trying to change how they behave. If they do change, if they do make different decisions about how they behave, well, that's cool. But it doesn't matter because number two, there's implicit in this boundary a way for me to enforce it. I know what I'm going to do when that boundary gets crossed. So when we set a boundary, there's no guarantee that that boundary won't get crossed. In fact, it's almost more certain that it will get crossed at some point. We have to take action to enforce our boundaries. Okay, so boundaries are not about controlling somebody else, and they're not about changing a situation. They're about taking care of ourselves. And that means that boundaries are for us. They're not for the other person. They're for us. So think about this in terms of the boundaries that you set with your family, with your children. How do you set boundaries with your kids in ways that are actually healthy and are about you? So I talked to a mom today whose boundary that she wanted to set was, my kid needs to get a job this summer. That's my boundary. And I said, that's not a boundary. Let's think about how you might want to set boundaries around his choice to or to not get a job. Might just sound like wordsmithing when I change the way I'm saying this stuff, but it's a big deal. Because as soon as I said, how will you take care of yourself around his choice whether to get a job or not, all of a sudden, everything shifts. Everything shifts. all of a sudden I'm not in this impossible power struggle with my kid where I have to make them get a job. And I'm not in a situation where if I don't make them get a job, my alternative is to just like kind of bend over and, take it, where. Those aren't our choices. It shifts that paradigm that's so common in parenting, which is I either dominate you or I'm dominated by you. You're either a tyrant or I'm a tyrant. When we shift to actually just owning our own stuff and realizing that the boundaries I set are for me, by me, and they will be enforced by me, and they're something that doesn't depend on anybody else. Holy cow. Now we can talk about like, oh, right, my kid has a choice. They may or may not get a job. That's actually out of my control. And I have choice too. I have the choice of what I'm going to do based on their decision. And pretty soon we were talking about boundaries she could set. Like, well, I'm happy to pitch in financially to your summer expenses when you have a job. Oh my gosh, that's an awesome boundary. Amazing boundary. I can tell you a boundary that we set in our family, which was that our son would be, if he wanted to drive the car, that he was responsible for paying for his share of the car insurance on that. That was a really great inspiration for him to get a job. And we had several conversations where he told us, this is stupid. None of my friends have to pay for car insurance. I don't see why you're making me do this. It's not fair. He tried to prove it to us with math that we shouldn't be requiring him to pay for car insurance. And I told him over and over again, it's totally your call. I totally get it. It feels really frustrating and sad. It probably does feel really unfair. And I would feel the same way if I didn't see any of my other friends paying for car insurance and I were the only one doing it. It would feel unfair to me too. And it's totally your call if you don't want to do this. You absolutely do not have to be on our car insurance. I'll respect whatever choice you make. I was able to set a boundary and give so much choice and agency to my kiddo there. So you can see how when you shift from my kid has to get a job to how do I take care of myself around my kid's choices? Ooh, it's like night and day. And let's also talk about, in terms of boundaries, the difference between setting a boundary and enforcing a boundary. So this mom could set a boundary, which is, I have the expectation that you will get a job this summer, and I'm going to really take care of myself around that expectation. Okay, great. You set that boundary. Or how about, let's use another example. Lots of examples for younger kids, like, dessert is for kids who finish their dinner. Or, after 9 p.m., it's lights out in our family. Or, bedtime is 8:30, or screen time ends at 7 p.m. These are all great boundaries, and they are only as good as your enforcement of them. So when you say, okay, I know I said you couldn't have dessert, but it's fine. I made this cake and I want it to go to waste. Okay, yes, normally it's time for us to go to bed and it's lights out, but okay, it's fine for you to use a flashlight. Or, okay, screen time was supposed to end at 7, but I forgot to turn off the TV. So here we are. Or grandma's visiting, so I guess you can have an extra hour screen time. Or you're sick, so whatever. As soon as we acquiesce on our boundaries this way, that's not really a boundary anymore. The enforcement of the boundary is what really actually determines like how sound and strong that boundary was. So think through when you set your boundaries. Do not set a boundary that you either cannot or realistically will not enforce, because you've set yourself up to teach your child that your words don't mean a whole lot and that nobody really needs to listen when you talk because, maybe not, who knows, we'll see. Mom's always setting these boundaries, but she never follows through, right? So think about it. If it's not worth it to you to follow through, then it's probably not worth it to set the boundary in the first place. And I'll give you an example of this. How many boundaries my clients realize as we're working together, like, I actually don't really care about that. So this same mom was talking to me about a pet that their kiddo had, and her husband really cares that the kid takes care of the pet exclusively and really, really matters to him. And through our conversation, she realized, like, I actually don't care. Like, I don't mind if I'm the one who takes care of the pet. It doesn't bother me. And I've also come up with these other strategies that mean that we don't really need to take care and do all this work that we thought we did when we first got this pet. And all of a sudden, she kind of realized, like, wow, I really don't need to be setting boundaries around this pet because I actually don't care. Like, our boundaries are something that comes from us. Like, they come from our values, what's important to us, but we need to feel good and safe and sound. So, the classic example I use a lot is jumping on the couch. In some families, it really makes everyone want to pull their hair out when kids are jumping around on the furniture. And in other families, nobody cares. It doesn't bother me. I truly don't feel any less at peace when you're jumping on the couch than when you're not. So I'm not going to waste my time having a rule around that. Right. So actually think about how many of the boundaries you have do you even really care about? Think about that. And then the last thing I want to talk about when it comes to boundaries is, why do we need to have boundaries? We've talked about just these in this conceptual way. Any relationship is only as strong as the boundaries within it. When someone sets a boundary with you, it's because they want to keep you in your life. Let's talk about that in terms of kids, because you might have heard a million times in your life, kids need boundaries, kids need structure, kids need a container, kids need, predictability, all of that stuff. It's all true. It is all true. And what sometimes doesn't get talked about around those ideas is how we enforce a boundary, how we create a container, how we set up consistency. If we're doing it through anger, if we're doing it emotionally, if we're doing it with intensity, it's actually not a boundary anymore. We're just slipping into codependency. You have to be better because I'm so upset and I won't stop being upset until you're different. That's not a boundary. That is not a healthy relationship. That's codependency. I can't feel okay unless you're doing the thing that makes me feel okay. My feelings are your job. That's not boundary setting. That's not healthy relationships. That's codependency. So let's talk about how we enforce those boundaries, because kids do need them. The best way that someone ever explained to me the value of boundaries was actually a Love and Logic class that I was in a long, long, long time ago. And the person told us all to close our eyes. So unless you're driving, I encourage you to do this right now. Close your eyes. So it's like pitch black. And I want you to imagine that you just wake up in this darkness. You just appear into this void. You don't know where you are. You don't know what's happening around you. You can't see anything. You can't feel anything. You don't know who's there. You don't know who you are. You don't know anything. You are just in a black void of space. How would you get your bearings and figure out what you were doing and figure out what you wanted to do and where you were? Well, if you couldn't see, it was pitch black, you'd start feeling around in that room, right? You start feeling like, oh, okay, here's the floor. And then maybe you'd like move your hands wider and wider away from you until you felt like come up against a piece of furniture or a door or the wall. You might come up against a shoe and realize like, oh, there's a foot in this shoe. There's another person in this room with me. That exploration and touching, and you need to come up against these things to understand the space that you're in. This is exactly what is happening with kids. They are born on this planet not knowing pretty much anything except the feeling of either safety or lack of safety that they have from creating their attachment and connection with the parent figure. And as they move through life, they are experimenting, they're exploring, they're feeling around their space to come see, what do they come up against? How can I make in my mind a conceptual image and picture of the space that I take up and that I find myself in? What defines my environment? Without boundaries, these kids are feeling and feeling and feeling, and they never come up against anything. The world is a very vast, confusing, unpredictable void. And we see kids like this go one of two ways. One is that they become very controlling themselves. So they're almost tyrannical and domineering in their family. Well, if the grownups aren't going to take the reins, somebody needs to. It is a very, very scary feeling to feel like you're the kid and you have to be the grownup. And these kids sometimes can become super, super controlling. But what's been behind that that attitude of controllingness is a feeling of being out of control. And then we have the kids who they don't become controlling. They just really are out of control. They're wildly experimenting in the world because they don't understand anything about how their universe works. Do you think about the boundaries that you put in your child's life, the boundaries that you have in your relationship with your child? They are so helpful. They make the world make sense, as long as we are enforcing them calmly and lovingly and with emotional intelligence and regulated nervous system. And that is why I have a job, because it's really, really easy to sit here and talk about boundaries in this conceptual way. Boots on the ground, it is challenging. When the rubber hits the road, enforcing boundaries without anger, without frustration, without emotional coercion, it is very, very challenging. And there's a reason why people need help to do it. Most of us were never taught this when we were kids. It's not our natural way of being, because it's not our default, because it's not what we have ever experienced before. We are breaking the mold when we choose to parent this way. And that means that we need to resource everything around us to actually create the skill set that is needed to do that. And that's where someone like me comes in. So if you're thinking, I want to do all the stuff that Anne's talking about, but I don't know how, that's my job. The podcast is just a really fun thing I do on the side. What I'm doing day to day is meeting with moms and dads all day, every day, talking through these challenges, troubleshooting them, using real life examples, and walking them through the journey from well-intentioned but not so skilled to actually living and walking that talk. So if that sounds interesting to you, I encourage you to click on the links in the show notes, set up a discovery call with me, and let's talk about it. And don't you forget that we have to finish our episode out with a question from the listeners. And I chose this question because I thought it fit really well with this idea around boundaries. Because the question is, how do you get your kid to do chores? And the first thing I say is, you don't get anyone to do anything except yourself. So let's shift that question around and say, how do I set boundaries around my kids' choices to whether or not to do chores? Now, if you're working with me, there's a whole little exercise that you're going to get in your coursework that's about chores. It's about how to decide what chores you want to set up for your kids, how to include your kids in that decision, how to set up a really awesome chore chart so that no matter how old your kid is, they can see what their chores are, all of that stuff. But all of that is just creating a plan. Then we need to set boundaries and enforce them around that plan, because otherwise it's just a really fun conversation you had with your kid about chores and emptying the dishwasher and all that good stuff. So how we enforce boundaries around chores, that is a very specific to each family kind of question sometimes, but in general, we would say like chores are for, our privileges are for kids who have completed their chores. So if your child decides not to do their chores, we do not sit there and argue with them. We don't try to force them to do their chores. We don't remind them a million times. It's their choice if they're going to do the chores or not, because guess what? It's our kids' choice always what they do in their life. And they may make the decision to not do their chores tonight. And then we need to respect their decision, which is another reason why enforcing boundaries is massively helpful at bringing people together, because it's respect. When you tell me you're not going to do your chores, I respect your choice. And I will even say, you probably know better than I do whether or not you want to do your chores or whether doing your chores is the right decision for you. So you've decided not to do your chores. I respect that decision. In our family, screen time is for kids whose chores are done. And it's totally cool that you chose not to do that tonight. There won't be any screens, but that's your choice. And I totally get it. If you enforce your boundaries around chores or around whatever, the odds that your kid's going to make a different choice next time are very high. But we never go into parenting, into discipline, with the idea that the point is to get our kids to change their behavior. It's this like weird thing where it's like, do not look directly at the sun. The more you want something, the less you're likely to get it, right? So instead, we don't put our eyes on that prize. We put our eyes on a way healthier prize, which is, how do I take care of myself around this thing? What boundaries am I going to set around this discipline situation? And understand that in the end, when the discipline changes, when the behavior changes, it will have changed because your child decided to change. And because it's their decision, we need to be patient. We need to take care of ourselves while they make that choice and all of those things. So I hope that's really helpful for you. It was really, really fun to talk to you about boundaries. This is something we could talk about forever. So keep your questions coming. If you have a question and you want me to answer it on the podcast, go to my website and contact me. There's an amazing little contact me button on there. The website is AnnKaplanParentCoach.com. Get your questions into me and I will answer them on the podcast, and you'll be like famous for a minute. It'll be great. I'll talk to you guys again soon. Bye, everybody. The episode is over, but there's more waiting for you. You can grab my free workbook, Getting Kids to Listen the First Time, that walks you through the fundamental principles I teach all of my clients and applies them to this very universal parenting challenge. So if you're sick of repeating yourself all day long or just want to learn more about my style, you'll definitely want to go to bit.ly/kidswholisten. And if you're ready to work with me, let's meet. Set up a free call at bit.ly/KaplanCall, and let's create an action plan that gets you exactly where you want to go. And of course, links to all this goodness are in the show notes. Thanks for joining, and I'll see you next time.